If you grew up in Canada, there was a Northern electric telephone in your house, bolted to the kitchen wall, or sitting heavy on the hall table, the receiver worn smooth by every hand in the family. You remember the weight of it, the whir of the rotary dial spinning back, the way you could drop it, slam it, yank it off the counter, and it still gave you a dial tone. Behind that indestructible phone stood a giant, 94,000 employees, the ninth most valuable company on Earth. It survived 2 world wars, survived the Great Depression, survived being cut loose from its American parent, and answered by inventing an industry. And then, after more than a century of making things people held in their hands, it filed the largest bankruptcy in Canadian history. How does a company that survived everything simply disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Weight of the Receiver. The story begins in Montreal in the summer of 1882, with a problem and a dead man. The problem belonged to a former New England sea captain named Charles Fleetford Syce. He'd come north to Montreal 2 years earlier to run the Bell Telephone Company of Canada, and he had discovered something that unsettled him. The young company had no dependable way to make the one thing it sold: telephones, the instruments themselves. Canada, at that moment, could not reliably manufacture its own. The dead man was James Cowherd. Cowherd had run a small factory in Brantford, Ontario. By some accounts, the first building in the world put up specifically to make telephones. He'd turned out nearly 2,400 sets to Bell's specifications, hand-assembled in a country that had barely heard a telephone ring. Then, in the early months of 1881, Cowherd died of tuberculosis. He was a young man. The factory closed with him, and Bell's supply closed with it. So Bell was left leaning on the Americans, and Syce didn't like it. He wrote to the head of the parent company in Boston with a plain proposal that they ought to be doing this work in their own shop, where they had 1 or 2 very good workmen. It wasn't grand ambition. It was necessity, the ordinary necessity of a man who couldn't get the parts he needed. On the 24th of July, 1882, Bell opened a mechanical department in Montreal. A staff of 3, soon 11. A foreman Syce had hired away from the Boston plant, a man named Charles W. Brown. 2 rented floors and a handful of tools. That was it. That was the seed of everything that followed. You have to understand what this was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a Canadian invention. It was a Canadian workshop, assembling American designs, tucked behind the tariff wall that Ottawa had thrown up in those years to encourage exactly this kind of thing. The national policy, they called it. Build it here, or pay a premium to bring it in. And so Northern was born the way a great deal of Canadian industry was born. American brains, Canadian hands, and a government fence keeping out the weather. It grew anyway. On the 7th of December, 1895, the little department was incorporated under a Dominion charter as the Northern Electric and Manufacturing Company, capitalized at $50,000, with roughly 93 of every 100 shares held by Bell. Syce was its president. By 1902, it had 250 people in a leased plant of 48,000 square feet. 10 years after that, it had grown to more than 240,000, 5 times over, and Northern had become Bell's storekeeper and purchasing agent, the place the whole telephone system came to for its parts. An indestructible object made behind a fence by a company that started because one man died. Hold that in your mind, because everything the company would eventually become, the giant, the collapse, the largest bankruptcy this country has ever seen, grew out of that modest, dependent beginning. And the strange thing, the thing this whole story turns on, is that they didn't lose it to any of the disasters you'd expect. They lost it to a decision. Chapter 2. Mr. Syce's Workshop. The Syce family ran the place for 2 generations, and the story of Northern's first 50 years is largely the story of a Canadian company learning exactly what it was permitted to be. In 1899, Bell bought a small plant that made rubber-coated wire from a man named Alexander Barry. It was chartered in Quebec, and in 1911, it was renamed the Imperial Wire and Cable Company. For 15 years, it ran alongside the electric works, 2 arms of the same body. Then, in January of 1914, the two were merged into a single company, the Northern Electric Company Limited. And by then, the ownership had shifted in a way that would shape the next 4 decades. Roughly 44% of the new company belonged to Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of the great American telephone colossus, AT&T. The rest belonged to Bell Canada. American money had bought a seat at the table, and American money got what it paid for. That same year, the company opened a great new plant on Shearer Street, in the working-class Montreal neighborhood of Pointe-Saint-Charles, hard against Griffintown and the Lachine Canal. It was the work of Bell's chief architect, William John Carmichael, an E-shaped 8-story building of red brick, designed to pull in as much daylight as the northern sun would give. A daylight factory, they called that style, in the years before electric light was cheap enough to waste. It opened its doors in January of 1915. Edward Fleetford Size, the founder's son, was president. His brother Paul was general manager. For the next 40 years, that building on Shearer Street was where Northern Electric came from, the beating heart of the whole operation. Here is what it made, and here is the thing that shaped everything after. For its first half-century, Northern Electric essentially rebranded Western Electric. It took the American designs and, quite literally, changed the nameplate, substituting one name for the other on the finished product. An engineer named Frank Mills, who lived through those years and would matter a great deal later in this story, put it as plainly as it can be put. All they were doing, he said, was changing the title. The product line ran 2 or 3 years behind the American parent, and the company was allowed to sell only inside Canada. It was a branch plant in the fullest sense of the word. The technology came from somewhere else. The important decisions came from somewhere else. And the Canadian job was to build the thing well and keep it inside the borders. But a branch plant can still be a marvel of a place to work, and Northern was. The catalog ran far past telephones, fire alarm boxes, police call boxes, telephone bells, and, because they'd mastered the art of making a bell ring true, sleigh bells, the first Canadian wind-up gramophones in 1900, toasters, kettles, cigar lighters, electric stoves, washing machines, radios, vacuum tubes, a little one they called the Peanut, $5, in 1922. And when the talking pictures arrived, it was Northern Electric equipment that carried the first synchronized sound in a movie theater anywhere in the British Empire, at Montreal's Palace Theatre. A Canadian branch plant, wiring the empire for sound. Then came the Depression, and it very nearly took the whole thing down. Between 1930 and 1933, Northern's sales collapsed from $34 million to $8.2 million. Not a decline, a collapse. In the same 3 years, the workforce fell from 6,100 to 2,400. More than half the jobs at Shearer Street, gone. A man who'd walked through those gates in the boom of the 20s with a steady wage and a future to build watched the whole thing shrink around him, month after month, until the daylight factory stood 2/3 empty in the gray Montreal winter. It survived. Barely, but it survived. And that fact matters more than almost anything else in the early part of this story, because survival became the company's whole character. 2 world wars would come. A forced divorce from its American parent. The deregulation of its entire market. Northern would come through all of it, every time. The company simply did not know how to die, which is exactly what makes the ending so hard to believe. Chapter 3. Changing the nameplate. The wars were good to Northern Electric, in the terrible way that wars are good to factories. In the First World War, it built a one-wire telegraphic field switchboard for the trenches, the portable commutator, a rugged little box that let officers talk along a single strand of wire. In the Second, it did far more. Radios for ships and aircraft and tanks, radar sets, the electrical gear that ran the destroyers of the Royal Canadian Navy. By 1944, the workforce had climbed to 9,325, and unlike the last time it had swelled and shrunk, this time it kept climbing after the guns went quiet. By 1948, Northern employed 12,775 people, In 1946, it put out a little table radio called the Baby Champ, and it sold 136,000 of them at $25 each. Canada was building houses and filling them, and Northern Electric was one of the companies doing the filling. And then, in 1956, something happened a long way from any Canadian factory floor that would change the company forever, and in the strangest way, save it. Down in the United States, the Department of Justice had been chasing AT&T through the antitrust courts for years. In 1956, the two sides settled with a consent decree, and one clause of that American agreement reached across the border and reshaped a Canadian company. Western Electric agreed to confine itself to the American market, and to do that, it had to let go of Northern Electric. It sold its stake, most of it in 1957, the remainder over the following years, until by 1964, Bell Canada owned the whole thing outright. The American cord was cut. For half a century, Northern had changed the nameplate on other people's inventions. Now there was no nameplate to change, no pipeline of finished designs flowing up from the south. If Northern Electric wanted a product to sell, Northern Electric was going to have to invent it, and it had spent 50 years being told, in effect, that inventing wasn't its job. Picture what that meant in the drafting rooms and on the floor. Fear first. The safety of the parent was gone, and the parent had been there since before most of them were born. And then, once the fear settled, something else. An engineer named Gordon Thompson, who'd hired on in 1947, described that moment better than anyone has since. With Western Electric dropping out, he said, they had to stand up, take the bat, and hit the ball out of the stadium, which, he added, they managed to do. They built the research capacity from almost nothing, a laboratory at Belleville in 1957, a dedicated research and development operation the year after, another in Ottawa in 1961. And on the 1st of January, 1971, Bell and Northern folded their research together into a single organization, Bell Northern Research. B&R became the largest employer of telecommunications research talent in the country. In some years, it hired as much as a third of every electrical engineering doctorate that Canada produced. A branch plant that had once needed permission to sell a phone across a provincial line was now soaking up the best technical minds the country could grow. The people who built it became legends inside the walls. Don Chisholm, B&R's first president, was known for a management style built on nothing more complicated than walking the floor and talking to the people doing the work. Rudolf Kriegler, the vice president of technology, held silicon processing patents that became an industry standard, and once quietly bet $400,000 of the company's money on an in-house laser project because he believed it would save Northern's fiber optics program. He was right. It did. By 1975, the company that had once been forbidden to sell abroad was running 24 plants at home and 6 in the United States, with a research outpost in a California valley called Palo Alto. Nobody there could have known it, but that valley would one day be the thing that killed them. For now, though, they had stood up. They'd taken the bat, and for a long golden while, they hit everything clean out of the stadium. Chapter 4. The lunch whistle stand on Shearer Street in Pointe Saint Charles at noon on a weekday in the late 1940s, and you'd have heard the whistle, and then you'd have seen them come. Up to 12,000 people worked at the Montreal plant at its height, and the neighborhood around it lived and breathed by its rhythm. Thousands of families in Pointe Saint Charles and neighboring Griffintown had at least one member working at the Northern: a father, a mother, a son, an aunt. When the midday whistle blew, the streams of workers poured out of the great red brick building onto Shearer and Richardson streets, and for a few minutes at the middle of the day, that whole working-class corner of Montreal belonged to the people who made things. There was a cafeteria inside. There were social clubs. The company built a small world around itself, and the neighborhood, francophone, tight, poor but proud, took its identity from the plant they came to call the Nordelec. The men who worked there remembered the numbers on their first pay slips for the rest of their lives. Andy Moreau hired on as an installer in 1955 at 71 cents an hour, one of the best wages in Quebec, he'd say later. and he wasn't exaggerating. The work took him to the ends of the country. He spent 4 years living in tents in 50 below cold, out on the roof of the continent, stringing the early warning radar line that was meant to spot Soviet bombers coming over the pole. Gilles Dumichel started on the 13th of December, 1965, at $1.65 an hour, and raised 3 sons on that weekly check. This was the bargain the factory offered, and kept: skilled work, a fair wage, a life a man could build with his hands and hold on to. And the thing those hands built sat in nearly every home in the country. The Model 500 was the telephone. Designed in 1949 by the great American industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss, it was built under license in Canada by Northern Electric as the NE500, and it was the standard rotary desk phone from the 50s clear through to the 80s. It weighed just over 5 pounds. Tough plastic molded over a steel chassis. It was, for every practical purpose, indestructible. The kind of object that outlived the house it was installed in, that got handed from a kitchen to a basement to a cottage and kept on working. And here is the detail that would come to matter more than anyone on that factory floor could have imagined. You didn't own it. You rented it from Bell. Every one of those 5-pound telephones was a line on a monthly bill. A captive market stretching flat to the horizon, guaranteed, renewing itself every 30 days. Then, in 1967, Northern did something it had never done in 85 years of existence. It designed a telephone of its own. The Contempra was the first telephone ever designed in Canada. It was the work of John Tyson, an Ontario College of Art graduate and Northern's first industrial designer. Angular, modern, unmistakably of its moment, with the dial, and later the push buttons, built right into the handset. You could hang it on the wall or set it on a desk. And it came in what the company's own advertising called 9 outrageously elegant colors, not one of them black. It was designed to be built at Northern's London, Ontario, plant, using as many Canadian components as could be sourced. It rented from Bell for $1.75 a month. It weighed a little over a kilogram. It won a Canada Design Council citation. It went on to a Canadian postage stamp in 1974. And it ended up in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, a Canadian telephone behind glass in Manhattan. Bell's president, R.C. Scrivener, explained the decision with a quiet, characteristic pride. They could have adopted an American design, he said, as they had done so many times in the past. But they thought they ought to produce their own. After 85 years of changing the nameplate, that was no small sentence. John Tyson put it more simply than any executive could. He didn't think, he once said, that there was a person in Canada who hadn't used one of his products. 200 kilometers to the west, in London, the plant on Wilton Grove Road turned out components. And it sat, as it happened, next to a road named Cisa, after the sea captain who'd started the whole thing a lifetime before. The London workers built the small, precise pieces that made the phones and the circuit boards work. The Montreal Francophone workforce built the community identity of the Nordelec. The unions came in, the production workers eventually represented by the Canadian auto workers, and the whole enterprise wove itself into the fabric of 2 provinces and 2 languages, English and French, Ontario and Quebec. A project manager named Ken Lyons said something about those years that never left him. Northern's products, he said, were almost too good. People would buy them, or rent them, and then never have a single problem. He said it with pride. But listen to it again, because there's a shadow in it. A company can be undone by a great many things, and one of the quieter ones is building a product so perfect that the world stops needing you to build another. By the early 1970s, Northern Electric was the sound of Canada talking to itself. The dial tone in the kitchen, the ring in the front hall, the 9 colors of a Contempra on the wall of a brand new suburban home. And nobody standing in that home, receiver warm against their ear, could have guessed that the company on the other end of the line had already begun, very quietly, to decide that the phone in their hand belonged to the past. Chapter 5. Building the Digital World. Because this is where the ground shifted, and almost nobody felt it move. Northern Electric's real genius, in these years, wasn't the telephone in your hand at all. It was the machine you never saw, the switch. The great banks of equipment inside the telephone exchange that connected your call to the one you were trying to reach. Having taken apart the American switching systems and rebuilt them for Canada, Northern began inventing its own, and the inventions were remarkable. A system called the SP1, a digital business exchange called the SG1, and then the SL1, the first fully digital private branch exchange in the world, not adapted from someone else, not built under license. First, the branch plant that had spent 50 years, 2 or 3 years behind the Americans, was suddenly, in this one thing, ahead of everyone. In 1976, the company changed its name to announce what it now believed it was. Northern Electric became Northern Telecom, and at Walt Disney World, of all places, it unveiled something it called Digital World, the industry's first complete line of fully digital telephone equipment. The DMS switches followed, the largest of them able to handle 100,000 lines at once, and they became engines of money. American sales jumped 130% in a single year. By the start of the 1980s, this Canadian company was the largest supplier of business telephone exchanges on Earth. Revenue climbed from $1.7 billion to $5 billion in less than a decade. In 1983, a new parent company was assembled above it all, BCE Incorporated, holding both Bell Canada and Northern Telecom under a single roof. And somewhere in those triumphant years, without a memo and without a vote, the company's picture of itself quietly turned over. It used to be a company that made phones. Now, it was a company that made networks. The switch, the system, the invisible architecture humming inside the exchange. That was the future. That was where the money was, and the glory, and the excitement. The telephone in your kitchen, the 5-pound Model 500, the Contempra in its 9 colors. Those were becoming, in the minds of the people at the top, the old business, the heavy business, the tactile, blue-collar, assembly line business, the past. For now, none of it showed. The London plant still hummed. The Montreal line still ran. Andy Moreau and Gilles Dumouchel still punched in and out. The company was a Canadian success story of the very first rank, a homegrown giant standing at the summit of a global industry it had helped to invent, run by engineers who'd learned to swing the bat when the Americans walked away. But the tariff wall that had sheltered it since 1882 was about to come down. The captive market of rented telephones, the guaranteed monthly line on every Canadian bill, was about to be set loose. And the men in the boardroom had already begun, ever so slightly, to fall in love with the invisible. Standing on that summit, in the bright confidence of the early 80s, not one of them could see the long way down. Chapter 6. Unplugging the kitchen phone. The wall came down on a specific date, and it didn't fall in a war or a crash. It fell in a regulator's ruling. In 1976, responsibility for regulating Canada's telephone system passed to the CRTC, and over the years that followed, the Commission began, carefully and deliberately, to open the market. In 1979, it allowed private lines to be connected to the network by outside suppliers. And then, in 1982, came the change that quietly ended an empire. Canadians were told they could buy their own telephones from any supplier they liked and simply plug them in. Like an electrical appliance, like a lamp. That was all. That was the whole thing, and it was everything. For 100 years, Northern's consumer business had rested on a single, beautiful fact. You couldn't buy the phone, you could only rent it, and the phone you rented came from them. The 5-pound Model 500, the Contempra in 9 colors, every one a renewing line on a Bell bill. In 1982, that foundation was pulled out from underneath the whole enterprise. The captive market was set free, and a free market wanted a cheaper phone than a 5-pound Canadian-built one. The phones started coming from somewhere else. Through the 80s and into the 90s, consumer telephone manufacturing in Canada wound down, shift by shift, and moved offshore, to Mexico, to India, eventually to China. The heavy, tactile business that had built Pointe Saint-Charles and given London its plant was becoming, exactly as the boardroom had decided, the past. Manufacturing at the old Montreal Nordelec had already ceased by 1974. Now the rest began to follow. Into this came a new kind of leadership and a new kind of thinking. Around 1990, an executive named Paul Stern took over as chief executive. He cut some 2,500 jobs. He closed 4 of the company's 41 plants. He shifted research and development away from Canada toward Texas and California, and it alarmed people who'd watched the company grow its brains at home for 30 years. The engineers Kriegler and Chisholm had assembled were a national asset. Now the center of gravity was drifting south, toward the same country the company had spent 1956 learning to live without. But the deepest error of these years wasn't about geography. It was about the future itself. The company misjudged the internet. As the world's engineers argued over what the coming digital network would actually run on, Northern bet on a technology called ATM over the humbler, open protocol, TCP/IP, that would in fact become the language of the internet. In 1994, the company went so far as to promote a proprietary system it called an infostructure, pitched as a kind of rival to the internet itself. It was backing the wrong horse in the most important race of the century, and it didn't yet know it. And then, in 1995, on the 100th anniversary of that little Montreal charter, the company gave itself a new name for a new age. Northern Telecom became Nortel. The kitchen phone was already unplugged. The workers who'd built it were already walking out for the last time, in London and in Montreal, carrying the same lunch pails their fathers had carried. And the company they left behind had turned its whole face towards something you couldn't hold, couldn't drop, couldn't hand down to your children. Something invisible. Chapter 7. The Right Angle. Turn. In 1997, the man who would take that invisible future and stake the entire company on it became chief executive. His name was John Roth. Roth was an engineer, a former president of BNR, one of their own, a man who'd come up through the research the company had built from nothing after 1956. He looked at where the world was going, and he saw it clearly, more clearly than most. The future was not voice. The future was data. He had a phrase for it. The company had to turn away from what he called dial tone, ordinary voice telephony, the business of connecting one person's voice to another, and toward web tone, the world of internet traffic and optical networking. He spoke of it as a right-angle turn, a hard pivot, the whole company wheeling 90 degrees in a new direction, consciously modeled on the way Microsoft kept reinventing itself. He was right about the destination. It was how he chose to get there that would break the company. Roth recognized that Nortel had a gap between what it could build and what the new world would demand. And he decided to close that gap not by building, not by turning the engineers of BNR loose on the problem the way the company had always done, but by buying. He would purchase the future, ready-made, with company stock. In August of 1998, Nortel bought Bay Networks, a data networking company out of Santa Clara, California, for $9.1 billion in stock. The press called it the deal of the century. In time, many would call it the beginning of the end, because the marriage never took. Nortel's culture was Canadian, engineering-driven, careful. One observer described its management as almost civil service-like. Bay Networks was Silicon Valley, fast and loose and hungry. The two didn't fuse, they repelled. And the newly enriched Bay engineers, their stock now worth a fortune, drifted away to Cisco and to 3Com, taking with them the very expertise Nortel had paid $9 billion to acquire. It didn't stop there. In 1998 alone, there were 4 acquisitions. In the year 2000, Nortel spent $19.7 billion buying companies. Clarify, Altion, Shasta, Exros, one after another. Nearly all of it paid for, not in cash, but in Nortel's own shares, printed and handed over. The company issued more than 160 million new shares in those late 90s years. The share count swelled from roughly 500 million in 1998 toward 3 billion within 2 years. And in the middle of the buying frenzy, Nortel looked at a small internet telephony pioneer called Celsius and passed on it. Cisco bought it instead for $116 million, a rounding error next to the $9 billion spent on Bay. And the market loved every minute of it. On the 26th of July, in the year 2000, Nortel's stock hit $124.50 on the Toronto Stock Exchange. The company was worth roughly $398 billion. It was, on that single summer day, the 9th most valuable corporation in the entire world. And it accounted for more than a third of the total value of the Toronto Stock Exchange's main index, 36.5%. One company, the other 299 companies on that index, combined, made up the rest. It employed some 94,500 people, 25,900 of them in Canada. John Roth was named the country's Chief Executive of the Year for 2000, and he cashed his own stock options that year for a personal gain of $135 million. There has never, before or since, been a moment when a single Canadian company mattered that much to the wealth of the country. Nearly every pension fund, every mutual fund, every ordinary Canadian with a stake in the market held a piece of Nortel, because to own the index was to own Nortel. The whole country was, without quite realizing it, standing on one stock, and the numbers underneath it had already begun to turn. Chapter 8. 99%. The first crack came in October of the year 2000, 3 months after the summit. On the 25th, Nortel warned that sales would fall short. In a single day, the stock dropped from $96 to $71, and the shock of it dragged the entire Toronto index down 840 points. Canada felt that one in its wallet, coast to coast, because Canada was holding the stock. Then, on the 15th of February, 2001, came the bombshell. Nortel had been telling the market to expect a profit of 16 cents a share. Now it said it would lose 4 cents instead. It slashed its growth forecast for the year from 30-odd% down to 10 or 15. The right-angle turn was not accelerating. It was stalling. And in the second quarter of that year, the full scale of it arrived. Nortel reported a loss of roughly $19.4 billion, the biggest quarterly loss in Canadian corporate history. Most of it was a single savage entry, a charge of more than $12 billion to write down the goodwill from all those acquisitions. All those companies bought with printed stock at the top of the market were now worth a fraction of what Nortel had paid. The bill for the buying spree had come due, all at once, in one line on one statement. John Roth's public words were the careful words of a man in a falling elevator. He was disappointed with the quarter, he said, but the company had taken the right steps to strengthen its leadership position. The market did not agree. By October of 2002, after a downgrade of its debt to junk, the stock stood at 69 cents. 69 cents for a share that had traded above $124 2 years before. Less than 1% of its value. 99% of it simply gone. But the number that mattered most wasn't on any exchange. It was in the parking lots. Across 2001 and 2002, Nortel cut roughly 60,000 jobs. The workforce fell from 94,500 toward 35,000. And these weren't abstractions. These were the labs. The descendants of the research operation the company had built with such pride and such difficulty after 1956, the labs that had once hired a third of the country's engineering doctorates. Now they emptied. An engineer named Paul Hanreader lived through one of the worst of these moments. He watched his entire division move to Beijing and was given 1 year to transfer everything his people knew, every hard-won piece of engineering knowledge, to the people who would replace them. God only knows, he said, how much knowledge was lost in that handover. 30 years of Canadian invention, packed into a 12-month handoff, and then the room went dark. The company that had learned, in 1956, how to stand on its own and swing the bat, was now, half a century later, shipping its swing overseas and switching off the lights behind it. Chapter 9. The Cookie Jar. There was one more turn to come, and it was the ugliest. Because a company that is drowning will sometimes reach for the surface in ways that look, in hindsight, a great deal like grasping. In November of 2001, as the losses mounted, the chief financial officer, Frank Dunn, was promoted to chief executive. Alongside him were the new chief financial officer, Douglas Beatty, and the corporate controller, Michael Galogly. And the story that would later be told in a courtroom, the story the Crown would try and fail to prove, went like this. The company had built up, over the bad years, large reserves against liabilities, excess accruals, in the language of accounting. And the allegation was that these reserves had become a kind of cookie jar, that they could be released back into the books at a chosen moment to manufacture the appearance of a return to profit. Turn a loss into a gain, not by earning it, but by reaching into the jar. And the timing of that manufactured profit, in the fourth quarter of 2002 and across 2003, happened to coincide with the thresholds that triggered executive bonuses. The profit of 2003 generated around $70 million in bonuses to the top 43 managers. Frank Dunn's share was $7.8 million. Beatty's was $3 million. Galogly's, $2 million. The company's own auditors, Deloitte and Touche, flagged the results to the chair of the audit committee, John Cleghorn, and to the board chairman, Linton Wilson, known to everyone as Red. Restatements followed, the company reaching back into its own published books and correcting them, once in 2003, again in 2005. On the 28th of April, 2004, Dunn, Beatty, and Galogly were fired for cause. Then the machinery of the law turned over, slowly, for years. The American and Ontario securities regulators brought charges in 2007. The RCMP laid criminal fraud charges in June of 2008. The trial finally began in January of 2012. And on the 14th of January, 2013, Justice Frank Morocco of the Ontario Superior Court acquitted all three men. The Crown, he ruled, had not proved fraud beyond a reasonable doubt, and a restatement, on its own, does not prove that the original accounting was false. Frank Dunn, after almost 9 years, said he was grateful to have received vindication. The American regulators dropped their remaining civil claims the following year. No one went to prison. And that verdict satisfied no one. Not the men who'd been cleared and had spent a decade under a cloud, and not the workers and pensioners who wanted someone, anyone, held to account for what had become of the company they built. Perhaps the truest thing anyone said about those years came not from a courtroom, but from a former president of the company, Bob Furchat, reflecting on the culture that could grow inside a place under that kind of pressure. If you cheat once, he said, then you cheat a little more. And finally, the whole thing becomes a house of cards. It becomes, he said, like heroin. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was describing how a great institution loses its way, not in a single crime, but one small compromise at a time, until the compromises are load-bearing. Chapter 10. 40 cents on the dollar. By the end, there was almost nothing left to hold together. Through 2008, Nortel lost billions more. A years-old Chinese hacking breach, discovered in 2004, had quietly compromised the company's most senior credentials. A security chief named Brian Shields had raised the alarm, and little had come of it. The chief executives cycled through, Roth, then Dunn, then Bill Owens, then Mike Zafirovsky, each inheriting a smaller company than the last. And on the 14th of January, 2009, Nortel sought protection from its creditors. In Canada, in the United States, in Britain, all at once. It filed one day before a $107 million interest payment was due. It was the largest corporate failure in Canadian history. Then they took the company apart, piece by piece, and sold it for parts. The wireless business went to Ericsson of Sweden for $1.13 billion. The enterprise business to Avaya for around $900 million. The optical business to Ciena. The carrier voice business to Genband. And then the crown jewels, the patents. Some 6,000 of them, The accumulated invention of BNR, of Kriegler and the labs, and half a century of Canadian engineering. They went to auction in the summer of 2011, and the bidding became one of the strangest scenes in Canadian corporate history. Google wanted the patents, and Google bid in a private language. Its offers were mathematical constants. One bid was Brune's constant, another the Michel-Mertens constant, another the number pi, $3,141,000,000 and change. The engineers were bidding in the numbers they loved. It wasn't enough. A consortium called Rockstar, Apple, Microsoft, BlackBerry, Ericsson, and Sony together, won the 6,000 patents for $4.5 billion. A judge overseeing the sale remarked that it would be a $4.5 billion mistake not to approve it. The inventions of a Canadian company, sold to the giants of the New World, its own choices had failed to conquer. Even the land went. The company's sprawling Ottawa campus, 370 acres, once called Silicon Valley North, was sold for $208 million and became the new National Defense Headquarters. All told, the asset sales raised around $7.3 billion. The legal and professional fees, across a proceeding that stretched on for years across 3 countries, ran past $1 billion of their own. But there is one group this story has to end with, because they are the reason it is a tragedy and not merely a business failure. Roughly 20,000 Canadian pensioners had built their old age on Nortel's promise. Machinists and installers and clerks and engineers, the Andy Moreaus and the Gilles Dumichels, the people who'd poured out onto Shearer Street at the lunch whistle. When the company fell, the pension fund fell with it, with a deficit estimated at $1.8 billion. Health and life benefits were cut off on the 1st of January, 2011. Ontario pensioners saw their monthly checks fall towards 60% of what they'd been promised. There was worse inside the wreckage. A volunteer advocate and financial analyst named Diane Urquhart testified before Parliament that around $100 million from a workers' health and welfare trust had been misdirected, and a $37 million loan left unpaid. On the 21st of October, 2009, more than 2,000 pensioners gathered on Parliament Hill, joined by the leaders of every opposition party. They formed a committee, the Nortel Retirees and Former Employees Protection Committee, under a man named Don Sproul, with an Ottawa chair named François Meunier, and with Frank Mills, the 35-year veteran who'd once described the old days of just changing the nameplate, coordinating the pensioners' communications. The men who'd built the company spent their retirement fighting for what was left of it. They fought for years, and in the end, they won more than anyone expected. A global settlement in 2016 divided the money that remained, and Canadian pensioners who had first been offered less than 10 cents on the dollar ended up at roughly 40, with Ontario recipients topped up to more than 90% of their original pensions. François Meunier explained the victory simply. The lesson, he said, was that you had to stick to your guns. It would have been easy to accept 8 cents on the dollar. It just wasn't in their makeup to walk away. But the arithmetic of the fight is unbearable. By the time the courts had finished, more than 6,800 former Nortel employees and pensioners had died waiting for their money. Andy Moreau, the installer who'd lived 4 years in Arctic tents for the company, spoke for all of them. Every damn installer, he once said, participated in the growth of this company, not the president's. And now his pension was being diminished, polished off, and he'd paid for it himself. Somebody, he said, is stealing from me. It's a strong word. But he had no shame in saying it. The ruins are quieter than the fight. The old Nordelec on Shearer Street still stands, its red brick preserved, converted now into lofts and condominiums, and co-working desks where the assembly lines once ran and the lunch whistle once blew. In London, the plant on Wilton Grove Road became something called retained lands, fenced off, contaminated with the trichloroethylene and vinyl chloride left behind by decades of degreasing, waiting on a cleanup that would cost more than $100 million across all the company's old Ontario sites. A lawyer named Mark Matson, working for the health of Lake Ontario's waters, catalogued what had soaked into the ground beneath the place that once built the Contempra. Vinyl chloride, trichloroethylene, the residue of making things. a professor at the University of Ottawa named Jonathan Kaloff, whose team interviewed nearly half of Nortel's key executives from the crucial years, delivered the verdict that hangs over the whole story. It didn't have to happen, he said. Nortel did not need to die. That was the bottom line. And Ken Lyons, the project manager who'd said Northern's products were almost too good, found a way to keep the company alive that has nothing to do with money. He goes to a telecommunications museum every Wednesday to stand among the old switches and the old phones and to remember what Nortel used to be. Think about what this company survived. It survived the death of the man who was supposed to supply it. It survived being nothing but a nameplate for 50 years. It survived the First World War and the Second. It survived a depression that cut it in half. It survived being cut loose from its American parent with no products of its own, and it answered by inventing an industry. It survived the deregulation that ended its captive market. It was, by any reasonable measure, unkillable. And then it decided that the things it made with its hands, the 5-pound telephone in the kitchen, the Contempra in 9 colors, the tactile, heavy human work of 100 years, were the past. It turned away from them to chase something it couldn't hold. Not through one failure, not through one crime, or one bad quarter, or one villain in a boardroom. Through a long, quiet conviction that the tangible things no longer mattered, until the day there was nothing tangible left to save. The phone still works, in 1,000 Canadian basements and cottages and attics. Drop it, and it survives. Dial it, and it turns. It outlived the company that made it. And that is the last strange truth of Northern Electric. The objects proved indestructible, and only the empire that built them turned out to be fragile.